Hi, how you doing? My name's Elliot. I'm the University Specialist Writing Tutor. This is a session about writing a methods or methodology chapter for a dissertation or for an extended piece of writing. This is part of a series called Writing the Dissertation, where I walk you through the various chapters or sections of a typical dissertation, such as a literature review. And obviously in this case, we're going to be looking at a methods or methodology chapter of a dissertation or extended piece of writing. I'm going to explain in a moment what we're going to focus on and what to expect from the session and how it's structured. But before we do that, let me just make a few points before we get started, just to clarify the suitability of this session for you. So this is going to be suitable for you whether you're an undergraduate or postgraduate taught student, master's student. To be honest, it's equally suitable if you're a research PhD student. Obviously, you just have to tailor the advice in different ways for the specifications of your research, but it's generally suitable for you across the board, regardless of what stage of study, what level of study you're at. I'm always very conscious when I design these sessions, given how different dissertations can be very different from one another. I'm very conscious about making sure the advice that I give is very specific and targeted and makes sense, of course, but I'm also mindful of not making the advice too specific so that it doesn't alienate a lot of you. So I've prepared the information I'm going to present for you today with that in mind. What I would say, though, is always bear in mind that you do need to tailor the guidance, particularly for this kind of chapter, the methods or methodology chapter, where you're talking very specifically about what you did and how. And obviously, as I said, no two dissertations are necessarily the same. So always tailor the guidance just to the demands and the context of your dissertation and your discipline. And always talk to your supervisor. If I say something that you're not 100% sure if it's applicable to you, then certainly, talk to your supervisor, explain what I said and the context in which I delivered that, and then you can talk to your supervisor about that. I've also I'm going to be using the language and the structure in this session and in the other sessions that adheres to the conventions of a typical dissertation. So your introduction, your literature review, your methods and methodology, your results, your discussion, your conclusion, that sort of typical structure. And I'm mindful that that isn't necessarily what you're going to do in a humanities context, for example, or in a law context, or some of you in social sciences. You won't necessarily follow that kind of structure. It's similar, but you won't necessarily have that structure, or certainly not those headings. So again, I'm mindful of making this session suitable for you, even though I'm not necessarily following that structure. In that case, if you don't follow that typical structure, you may well not have a methods or methodology chapter as such. But you will certainly have to present methodological information, more than likely in your introduction. So actually the information I'm going to present to you will still be relevant in this session, particularly when we later on get onto structure and when we get onto the what, how, why structure that we're going to look at. But bear in mind, it might not be a distinct chapter, but may well be actually integrated into the introduction. Most of you will have it as a chapter, but certainly it's not out of the ordinary to not have a methods or methodology chapter. So bear that in mind as well. Okay, so this is what we're going to look at. Just going to focus on the methods and methodology chapter and ensuring that you have a clearer understanding of its purpose and how to write and structure it in a clear and effective way. We're actually going to look at the difference between the methods and methodology chapter. And you're going to notice that I've been using both methods or methodology, and they are slightly different, and we just need to clarify the difference between those two. So we're going to define the difference between the two. We're also going to define the role that the methods or methodology plays in the whole context of the dissertation or an extended piece of writing. And then so the second half of the session, we're going to focus on structure, making sure you structure it in a clear, linear, logical way. And there's some sort of tips and guidance on that. I'm always mindful in these sessions that I don't just talk at you and dictate what you should do, but actually give you accessible, practical tips and guidance by looking at actual examples, so real past examples, and we're going to do that later on in the session. So I'm going to get you to do a little bit of reading with some real examples that will be on the slide. So I'll give you an opportunity to pause the videos at a certain point. Okay, so I always like to start this kind of session with this question: what is research? And as I've just said that there, I'm hoping that perhaps a few words, a few phrases are running through your mind. It's quite an open-ended question, perhaps a deceptively simple one. But what is research? So with this question, like I said, just have a think very, very briefly. What words or phrases are coming to your mind? And here is one definition we have of research in response to this question: what is research? And there's multiple definitions. It's not a single stable thing that you can define easily, research, but this is a pretty good definition. So in a general sense, research means finding out. Research results in the creation of knowledge to solve a problem, answer a question, and better describe or understand something. Now, I would suggest that there's a very good chance that one of the words or the phrases that you were thinking of just a few seconds ago is probably present on the slide in one form or another, not necessarily word for word, but the essence of what you were thinking is quite possibly, I would suggest, quite likely on the slide here. And I've asked hundreds of students this question over the years, and you tend to get pretty similar answers, which is particularly this idea of creating knowledge or solving a problem, answering a question. In other words, you're just trying to do something, and this is where the idea of a gap comes from, trying to do something that hasn't really been done before, which doesn't mean reinvent the wheel. It doesn't mean you have to do something completely innovative that's never been thought of or done before. Actually, it very rarely does mean that. Really, it's more about trying to build on existing knowledge. It's trying to develop knowledge further. It's trying to pose a question that hasn't perhaps been answered as thoroughly as you think it should be or should have been. So that's in essence what research is. It's about finding out something. It's about creating new knowledge. It's about cultivating knowledge. And the reason it's very important just to go back to basics really and establish what research is because you watching this will absolutely be doing that, whether you even realize it or not. If you're doing some sort of extended piece of writing, if you're doing an original dissertation project, an original piece of research, you will be trying to create new knowledge, trying to cultivate new knowledge, whatever it is you're doing. So that in essence is what you're trying to do. And the reason it's important to establish that in the context of the methods or the methodology chapter is because this is the chapter not necessarily where you answer the questions or that you solve the problem that you're trying to solve or answer, but this is the chapter where you contextualize your answer to the question or your resolution to the problem or whatever it might be. This is the chapter where you explain to the reader how you approached and designed the research. And if research is the method through which you try to formulate and cultivate new knowledge, then effectively this is the chapter, the methods or methodology chapter, where you establish those foundations for the reader. That's where you establish how you went about creating and cultivating that knowledge. So this is why this chapter is really important. And this is why the decisions you make in this chapter or in the research but are presented in this chapter have to be clearly articulated. So that's sort of the overarching reason why we do this chapter in this kind of work. It's to provide context to the subsequent chapters, results and discussion, where you actually tell the reader, well, this is what we found, this is how we've created new knowledge, this is what we now know that we didn't know before. And the methods or methodology chapter is where you explain to the reader how you set that research in motion and what decisions you made in order to cultivate that knowledge. In addition to that, as these bullet points point out here, and sort of just building on that overarching point, it's about contextualizing the results of your study. As I said, it's not enough just to explain and articulate to the reader what the knowledge is that you've created, but you also need to contextualize that knowledge, which basically means partly literature review, which you've already done in the linearity of the dissertation by this point, But in the methods or methodology chapter, in the context of that, it's about giving your reader a clear understanding of the approach that you took or the design that you implemented in order to cultivate that knowledge. So it's about contextualizing the results. It's not just enough to say these are the results. It's also this idea of sharing your approach with the academic community. So this idea that when you do a piece of work like this, you're sort of seen as being part of the academic community. This idea that you're building on existing work and you're contributing to this ongoing canon of research. And in that context, you need to articulate the approach and design of your research in a way that future researchers can adopt and adapt that research. So somebody needs to be able to read this chapter and completely understand the approach that you took, and therefore replicate that research if they want to, or revise or adapt that research if they want to. So it's about sharing the approach that you adopted. It's also, from a marker's perspective, you get in your marker's head for a minute, it's about demonstrating that you understand the central role that this chapter plays in shaping the results of your study. So very much like the contextualization point I made a minute ago, your marker's looking for your ability to show that you understand how certain decisions in this phase of research has a direct impact on subsequent decisions or on subsequent outcomes. So they want to see your ability to understand when qualitative or quantitative is necessary. They want to see your ability to pick suitable instruments, to make good decisions. And that has to be clearly articulated in this chapter. And that's why we're going to focus on structure later on, because often the information that you're expressing in this chapter isn't necessarily complex, certainly not compared to other chapters, but it's really, really important. It's the sort of foundational knowledge that you need to, foundational information that you need to get across to your reader. So it's also about that. It's getting across to your marker that you know that certain decisions have certain impact and so on. So that's sort of some of the reasons and the sort of overarching reason there why you do this chapter. As I said, I've been using methods and methodology. I've been careful to say methods or methodology because they're not the same. They are often used interchangeably, which obviously isn't particularly helpful, but they are actually different. There is a fundamental difference between the two, and we are going to look at this later on when we look at examples, so I'm not going to emphasize this point too much now. But briefly, method or the methods is simply just referring to the tool or the instruments used to conduct the research and how that was implemented. And in terms of a methods chapter, that comes across in a sort of very targeted, direct way. And it tends to be more associated with a scientific style of writing. A methodology is all of that as well, but it's more interested in this idea of the research process. And if you think about the construction of the word methodology, method being the tool or instrument and how you conducted the research, and ology, the suffix ology, obviously means the study of something. So this effectively means the study of research. And the methodology chapter, as compared to the method chapter, tends to be far more exploratory in sort of a discussion-like nature to this chapter. So that means you're more interested in the idea of research, and yes, of course, how you did it and what you did and how you implemented the tools and all of this stuff. But it's also more generally interested in the research process and the philosophical underpinning that shapes this process. So it's more about the study of research, and it tends to be far more of an exploratory chapter. And you tend to use academic sources to help explain certain decisions you made and perhaps discuss certain decisions that you, or certain methods or instruments, for example, that you avoided. But we're going to look at examples of these in a minute, just to clarify the difference between the two. So as I said, we're going to look at structure, because the structure of this chapter is really important. I mean, structure is just always important, and I always tend to focus on structure in some capacity because if you think of the role that structure plays in everyday life, it gives you sort of order, and it brings a sense of cohesion and logic to your day. It's the same in writing. Without a well-structured piece of writing, you lose the meaning, you lose the understanding of what the writer's trying to say. So it's very important to focus on structure. And in a methods or a methodology chapter, you need to, regardless of what your method is, regardless of whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative, regardless of the approach, generally speaking, that you take, you need to write it in a layered way. And some of you looking at this slide here might be familiar with this image. This is known as a research onion. And it's used in a variety of contexts, and generally speaking, it works across the board. It's rooted more in a business context, but it's not something I'm particularly interested in looking at in terms of the wording. So sort of ignore the words and the language used here. Focus more on the idea of this structure. So being a research onion, it's got these layers here that move from out to in. And that's the idea of this chapter. What you have to do from beginning to end is you have to move from out to in, or from broad to narrow. And it has to be in a layered, linear way that moves out to in sequentially, so in order of the decisions. And the reason this is important is because each of these layers has a direct impact on the next one. So the decision you make in this layer here impacts on this layer, and so on and so forth. And if we go back to what I was saying a minute ago about showing your marker, showing your reader your understanding of how the methods or methodology influences your research and the role it plays in shaping everything that comes in terms of the cultivation of knowledge and answering the questions and so on and so forth, you have to show your ability to structure this chapter in this way in order to show how the decisions have a knock-on effect. And that's what this layered structure is about, this out to in. So as I said, don't worry about the language. You don't even have to necessarily follow all these types of layers. You see there's a sort of a color-coded key here on the right. It's not really about that. That's not why I want to show you it. It's just the idea of out to in linear structure that I want to sort of emphasize as we go throughout. So that's the sort of general framework to think about how you structure this chapter. And often, people sometimes say to me, I didn't really do it in that order, to be honest. And the truth is, when you're designing and conducting research, it can be quite a messy process. Talk to your supervisors; they'll tell you, having done research, that it can be messy sometimes, and you have to go back and redo stuff, and you have to rethink stuff, and it's not always a clean, crisp process. And that's absolutely fine. You don't even need to deflect from that messiness in the write-up or ignore it. You can sort of embrace that sort of complexity and messiness when you write this chapter, but you can't articulate that in a messy, chaotic way. It has to be articulated in a clear, linear way. And so doing it in this way isn't so much about writing it in terms of mirroring how you did the research, because I appreciate that sometimes you might make a decision about doing a questionnaire before you decide whether it's qualitative or quantitative. The point I'm making is when you actually write the chapter up, you need to write it in a sort of clear, linear way from out to in, and broad decisions first, and then smaller, more narrow decisions as you go through. That's the way this chapter works structurally. So, building on what we just looked at, the sort of broad to narrow, this is generally the kind of structure you would follow for this chapter. Again, don't worry so much about the language, because sometimes you use instruments, for example. Sometimes it's you use participants or sampling and stuff like that. So there's different phrases and words that you can use. The language is somewhat flexible, but this general structure that you can see in front of you, particularly 2, 3, and 4 in that order, is really the way in which the methods or the methodology chapter should be structured. And quite simply, as I've said just a minute ago, because that really is the order in which you do it. Yes, you might go back and redo something and all that stuff, and that's fine. But generally speaking, this is the way it has to be articulated. For example, you can't really start talking about how you analyze the data until you've explained to the reader how you collected the data. So it's just that basic principle. So you want to start with a brief introduction. I mean, people often say to me, do I have to start the chapters in a dissertation or extended piece of writing with small introductions or very brief introductions? And not always, but generally it's good practice to do that. It gets the chapter off in the right way, and it helps to orient your reader and give them direction. And so we're going to look at a very brief example of that in a minute. Then once you get into the main bulk of the chapter, you're going to be doing design, collection, analysis. So design is, we're going to look at this in a minute, but on the next slide, I think. But the design is, the qualitative, quantitative. What instruments did you use? Was it questionnaires? Was it focus groups or whatever? Then you're looking at data collection. So how did you actually collect the data? Talk through that process. And then what did you do once you had the data? How did you process it? How did you analyze that data? So this is the general structure. 5, 6, and 7 there, you'll see I've put can be integrated throughout. So you've got the validity and reliability. These are two concepts that we're going to look at in a few minutes. Absolutely crucial to this chapter, to the idea of research, validity and reliability. You may have heard of them before. I'll mention them in a moment. They can be dedicated their own section, or they can be integrated throughout. A lot of people like to have them as a subheading in themselves because it helps to draw the marker's attention to them, which I totally get. I can see that as a valid point. But they can also be integrated throughout. So when you're talking about, the way you collected the data, if you have a validity point or a reliability point that links to that, you can integrate it there and just integrate it all the way throughout. That's another way that you can do it. When we go into the structure of the what, how, why in a moment, that will be a bit clearer because validity and reliability really links to the why. Ethical considerations, you may not have to do this, but if you do, you just need to say a little something about any ethical issues that you were presented with and what you did and how you protected anonymity or whatever it might be. Again, that can be integrated throughout. So if you've got a if you're talking about data collection and you've got a few points you want to make about ethics, then you can include that there. More often than not, this is its own subheading, and it works fine like that. You can just have an ethical consideration subheading or something like that, and then just explain to the reader that you applied through Ergo, etc., and all of that stuff. Limitations as well. This does not have to be in this chapter. Often it's not. Sometimes it is though. If it's not in this chapter, it should either be in the discussion or in the conclusion. But you can have limitations in this chapter. You would expect as a marker for there to be a decent discussion of limitations somewhere in the dissertation, if not in this chapter. So that's why I've said it's optional. Again, this can be integrated throughout. If you've got a couple of limitations related to the design, a couple of limitations related to the collection, then the analysis, you can just integrate those throughout. That sort of helps the flow. Again, if you want to have it as a subheading, that's also completely fine. It's pretty common to do it either way. So we're going to focus on 2, 3, and 4, or the idea of 2, 3, and 4 in a minute. And we're going to look at some of the other stuff as well, but I want to just go in that order. So start with introduction. So I'm just going to leave this on the slide here. This is a very short introduction to a real methodology chapter. This is from a methodology chapter. And this is the intro. It's pretty short. It'll take you a few seconds to read. I suggest you just, when you're ready, pause the video, have a read of that, and then I'm just going to talk you through what makes this work as a good introduction to a methods or methodology. So just pause the video when you're ready and have a read of that. And hopefully you've had a look at that, and I'm just going to talk you through what makes this a good introduction to a methodology chapter. So there's 4 points really I want to make here. So this first one here, right at the beginning, I've put flow. There's a linear transition from the previous chapter. One of the things you find when people write a dissertation or extend a piece of writing like this is inevitably you write all of the chapters separately, and then there comes the point where you pull it all together. You've got to bring it all together to submit it as a whole piece of work. And too often people don't think about those little transitions between the chapters. And so there often isn't that flow when you're moving from one chapter to the next. Just think of it as though you just got to create little bridges to help link one chapter to the next. In this case, the literature review to the methodology. And the writer does this really, really well here at the beginning. They've said the previous chapter described an overview of linear TV advertising, followed by the use of stimulus repetition process with the purpose of reaching the target audience effectively. And they continue there to explain what they did in the previous chapter, which was, as I said, the literature review. And what this helps as a reader, from a reader's perspective, is it helps you get from the previous chapter into this chapter, and it just gives you a reminder of what the previous chapter was about and what you showed them, and how it links moving into this chapter. Now, if you've done that sort of overview at the end of the literature review, then you don't need to do it again here. But they hadn't done that in this case in the literature review at the end of the literature review, so they just did it at the beginning here, and it just helped the reader get from that previous chapter into this chapter. And then what happens is, number 2 here, they end up with these 2 research questions. So this could be your aim, research questions, hypotheses, whatever it is that you're trying to answer or respond to. And again, these can appear in the literature review. Often they do. They could appear throughout the literature review if they're questions and they link to certain parts of the literature review, or they can just appear at the end of the literature review. And again, if they appear at the end of the literature review, there's really no point having them right here at the beginning of the methodology or methods chapter. It's just repetitive. However, in this case, again, like number 1, they didn't do this at the end of the literature review. So they've used this first bit here as a transition to remind the reader of what they did in the previous chapter and to get them into this methodology chapter. They've then linked it here to these 2 research questions and said, based on this literature review, these are the 2 questions we've generated. There's no right or wrong way to do it based on the options I've just given you. You can do it in the literature review, you can do it here. You don't, as I said, don't want to do it at the end of the lit review and then right again at the beginning of the methodology chapter. It's just repetitive. And your supervisor might have certain preference, you might have certain preference. I have to say, certainly in the context of this one that we're looking at here, it does work really well when you have your research questions, your aim or hypotheses or whatever, reinforced for the reader again at the beginning of this chapter. And the reason is because it links back to what we said a few minutes ago. This chapter, the whole dissertation of course, but this chapter in particular, centers on these questions or hypotheses or whatever, in this case these 2 questions, because answering these 2 questions is going to be the cultivation of new knowledge, i.e. the purpose of doing the research. And this chapter is about explaining to the reader what measures were taken, what decisions were taken in order to cultivate that knowledge, in order to answer these questions. So it frames the chapter really nicely when you put the questions that you're trying to answer at the beginning of this chapter, and it really helps to focus your reader's attention on those 2 questions. And it quite simply means that when they're making judgments on the quality of your methodology or methods based on how suitable the decisions you made are in terms of answering these questions, it makes their life a bit easier because you've just reminded them the questions again at the beginning. So these are the little techniques and tips that really make a difference to the readability of your work. So that works well here. 3 here, we've got a very brief summary of the design, literally in a sentence, that they've said in order to answer these questions, this study conducts semi-structured interviews using open-ended questions with 4 relevant industry professionals. Now, you're going to obviously go on to discuss that and elaborate on that in far more detail throughout the chapter. So really, that's all you need to say. But it's just a nice, very, very brief overview of the general design and approach of the research of the study. You don't have to do that, but it's an option. It just gives your reader a little bit of signposting of what's to come. And then you're going to have, after that, some sort of summary of the chapter, summary purpose of the chapter, of the structure of the chapter. So just explaining that, this is what this chapter is about, this is how it's structured, this is what we want to focus on. Again, your marker obviously knows this from the title of the chapter. They know that's what you're going to do. But these are sort of the conventions that just help get the chapter moving at the beginning, just to help get the reader from the previous chapter into this one. So that constitutes a really good example of an intro for a methods or a methodology chapter. You don't have to do all of those parts that we've just looked through there, but that's a really good example for you to follow or adapt. And just think carefully about that flow from the previous chapter into this one. And that's a general rule across the whole dissertation, of course. Just think about the flow between the chapters. So we're going to have a look a little bit here at design, collection, and analysis, and then we're going to look at two examples, one from a methods, one from a methodology, both of which were taken right from the middle of the dissertations that are dealing with at least one of the design, collection, or analysis that you can see here. So I can't go into too much detail necessarily here, because it's at this point that one dissertation methodology will move in a very different direction to another dissertation methodology, regardless of the disciplinary context. So I can't be too specific here because it won't be suitable or relevant for you. So what I've done is I've just sort of listed the dominant questions that you have to sort of answer, the dominant issues that you have to address in this part or these parts of this chapter. So design, collection, analysis, and just to reinforce again, it has to be structured in that order for the flow to make sense, for it to make linear sense. So design, you're dealing with quite broad overarching decisions here. So theoretical position. If you're doing a method, you almost certainly won't do that. That's the sort of philosophy, theory idea is much more of a methodology sort of principle. Qualitative, quantitative, or mixed, obviously is one of the sort of overarching dominant decisions that you have to make very early in the research process, and you have to make it very clear where you are at this early stage of the chapter. So your subsequent decisions link to that decision about whether it's qualitative, quantitative, or mixed. And what instruments, research instruments, did you use? Focus groups, interviews, etc. That tends to be the term used, instruments, for the questionnaires or for interviews or for whatever. But I appreciate that some of the language quite often is flexible and interchangeable. Collection. At this point, you're thinking more specifically about how did you actually collect the information? How did you collect the data? What resources did you use? If you were dealing with participants, what was the sampling method? What was the sample? What factors did you include or exclude in making the decision about who you're going to engage with in this research process? I've put there, describe the process. This is really important. What was the experience like for the researcher or participant? It depends on the nature of your research, but if you are dealing with, for example, if you're interviewing in the case that we just looked at in the introduction, if you're interviewing industry professionals, then try and describe what the experience was like for those participants. How did they receive the invitation to take part? What did they have to do? How were the questions posed to them, etc.? You just want to make that very, very clear to the reader. Again, that's very much part, as I said earlier, of the process of giving your reader a clear idea of how you did it, so that it can be adapted and replicated if somebody chooses to do so. And then analysis, once you've explained how you collected the data, you'll then explain what you did with it and how you processed it and analyzed it. So any necessary preparation, what instruments or framework did you apply? Did you use software? Did you use coding? If you used coding, for example, don't just say you used a 4-step process. Explain what that process was. Explain what each step included. Were there any viable alternatives? Was there anything else you could have done that didn't do? Again, this is much more of a methodology tradition than a methods tradition. And just explain the steps taken, as I said, with the coding, if it's a 4-step process, explain each step, not in massive detail, but just give the reader a clear understanding, paint that picture for them. And don't present any results here. It's tempting because you're talking about the analysis of the results. And the chances are when you write this, you may well have the results, but don't present the results here. Unless there's some very specific reason why you have to say something about the results. Otherwise, there shouldn't normally be any need to. That has to be reserved for the findings or results chapter. So as I've sort of said a few times, it needs to be a vivid account of the practical steps taken. Vivid in terms of you have to paint the picture, a very clear picture for your reader. It has to be absolutely clear how you did it, what steps you took, so that you paint that picture in your reader's head. And it's got to be clear, linear, and logical, and it must be sufficient enough detail, as I said, for the reader to really visualize the whole research process, and potentially for somebody to replicate it. So that's the detail that is necessary. You don't need to go into unnecessary detail, but certainly enough detail for somebody to replicate the research. This what, how, why structure you see here is very, very important, and we're going to look at that now in a couple of examples. And this is a three-part structure, not to structure the whole chapter. So it's not to say you have three sections, a what, a how, and a why. But this is actually something to really help you structure each of those key decisions that you make. So when you explain, for example, that you used a focus group approach, you have to explain how you did that. And then importantly, and this is really where the marks sit in this chapter more than any other part, you have to explain why you adopted that approach. Why focus groups, and why did you adopt the focus groups and implement the focus groups in that way. So this what, how, why structure is something that really structures all the key decisions you make in this chapter and present in this chapter. And without trying to oversimplify this chapter in terms of the way it's written, if you get that what, how, why structure right, you can't go too wrong with this chapter. As long as your decisions are cogent and clear, and you follow this what, how, why structure, and really, to a degree, emphasize the why and really justify your decisions, that's where a lot of your marks are, and you'll do really well in this chapter. It doesn't necessarily have to be in that order. There can sometimes be good reason for you to say why first, in terms of saying, focus groups are considered a good way of getting information because of X, Y, and Z, and then you can say therefore this research adopts a focus group approach, and this is how it did it. So it doesn't have to be in that exact what, how, why structure, but those three components need to be there, and the why in particular needs to be emphasized, particularly for a methodology, but also to a degree for a methods. But that's all I'm going to say about that now, because we're going to look at a couple of examples. So this is sample B. On the next slide is sample C. One is a methods, one is a methodology. So just very brief examples that I've taken from the middles of two dissertations. So one is a methods, one is a methodology. I'm going to get you to have a look at B, then get you to have a look at C. And these are the questions, the sort of three questions I want you to think about. I want you to think about which one you think is a method and which one you think is from a methodology. Can you detect the difference between the two? That sort of links to the last question. Are there any notable differences between the two? And does that determine for you which is which, methods or methodology? And can you also identify any instances of the what, how, why structure? Can you see that what, how, why three-part structure in play in these two paragraphs? So I'm going to need you to have a look at B to pause the video, and then I'm going to go to the next slide and we'll look at C, and you'll see the same questions on the next slide for C as well. So when you're ready, pause the video and have a look at B. And you should have had a look at sample B, and now I'm just going to allow you to pause the video to have a read of sample C. Okay, so which ones are methods, which one's from a methodology? That was one of the questions I wanted you to have a think about. So sample B is actually the methodology example. Sample C, therefore, is from a methods. And I'm going to talk you through sample B and some of the points I want to make about sample B, more generally about what works in this example and perhaps what doesn't work. And then we'll do the same for C. And we'll also think a little bit about the difference between the two chapters in terms of methods and methodology. So you should notice from one, really just from the top all the way through to the bottom, you should notice that it moves from this broad to narrow position. That's sort of that onion structure that we were looking at earlier, that layered out to in structure. It starts with those sort of broader decisions first, about it being qualitative and about there being interviews selected. The further you get down, the more specific and narrow the information gets. So that's just a general point I wanted to make. There's a couple of examples of what, how, why, 2 and 5. If we just have a look at 2, you'll see that there's an example here. So we've said here that the qualitative nature of this study, interviews have been selected as the primary means of data collection. So that's the what, the interviews. And then the interviews were conducted via video chat. So that's how they were conducted. And then this was the preferred option compared to interviewing participants over the telephone, because video chat allowed the researcher to observe the interviewee's facial expressions and body language. So that's the why. That's the justification of why they did interviews, but more specifically, why they conducted the interviews via video chat. And you see it's pretty brief, it's direct, it's to the point, but that little bit of justification there does a lot of work for you in terms of getting you the marks, because you're showing your reader that you understand the research process, and that you understand your research process and why you made these certain decisions. And this is really important to articulate to your reader in this chapter. So that's an example there, the what, how, why. Straight after that, the bit in orange here, next to number 3, they've said this can bring a new dimension to the data. This is something that doesn't work so well in this example. Is I've put there vagueness, and this is something you have to absolutely avoid in this chapter. You can't be vague. I mean, you shouldn't really ever be vague anyway in writing, of course, in a dissertation context. But certainly in this chapter, if you're going to avoid vagueness anywhere, it's in this chapter, because it needs to be clear, precise, and articulated to the reader in a way that they can completely understand and visualize, as I've said. Now, in this case, the fact that they have used video chat as opposed to telephoning, as they've said here, is to observe interviewees' facial expressions and body language. So that's fine. They then try to elaborate on that to say that this can bring a new dimension to the data. Now, I, in a literal sense, don't really know what they're talking about there. I don't know quite what that means. I mean, what does bring a new dimension mean? Does it mean more nuance, more complexity, perhaps? But even that's a little bit vague. I mean, they could be more specific, and they could give an exact example of what they mean and why that's important. So you've got to try and avoid that vagueness. Try and be as literal as possible. I put next to that as well, the interviews will be conducted using an open-ended, so the interviews will be conducted. This is a tense issue, and you find that in this chapter, sometimes people move between different tenses, which you need to generally try and avoid. There sometimes might be good reason to do that, which is fine. But if you're explaining what you've done, it quite simply should be in the past tense. There might be some good reason why you don't think it needs to be, and your supervisor might suggest a reason why it doesn't need to be. But generally, convention dictates that this chapter is written in the past tense, quite simply because you've already done it. We've already talked about this what, how, why. 5 around there is another example. It's sort of this whole second part of this paragraph here, so sort of 6, sort of around here to the bottom. I've put here more exploratory than sample C, and this bit here really more than any indicates that this is a methodology as opposed to a methods, because it's exploratory in nature. And what I mean by that is they don't simply say what they did, how they did it, and briefly why, as you sort of see in the next example. It's more exploratory in the sense that they're really exploring the whole research process. They're not just saying what they did, but they're also considering alternative approaches. You know, they're saying, you know, that a structured form of questioning is something that can be useful in certain research projects. But then they said, you know, however, open-ended questioning for this is a much more suitable approach. So they're exploring alternative options. They're discussing that through secondary literature, which in this chapter is absolutely fine, on the basis that you are not purely theoretical, but you're actually applying the evidence. And this is the key, that you don't just talk about this stuff in a theoretical sense, but you actually apply the evidence by linking it back to the decisions that you made. And the reason this is important is because otherwise this ends up becoming a bit like a second literature review, and you don't want it to be that. You want it to be purely based on what you've done, and you can use secondary literature to justify the decisions you made. Just make sure you link it quite, you know, precisely to the decisions you made. So those are some of the points there that makes this a good example, with a few flaws around 3 and 4 as a sort of brief issues I mentioned there. But you know, this is a good example of a methodology. As I said, C is a method, and you can see from the beginning we've got the what, how, why structure going on there. The why here being that both the sampling technique and use of social media both the sampling technique and use of social media allowed for quick and convenient data collection. So that's their why. They're justifying why they used social media and why they used that particular sample. You'll notice it's not exploratory compared to the previous example, the second half of the previous example, but that works. It's clear, it's precise, it's direct, and the why is really important because it justifies the decisions that they took, or in this case, the use of social media and the sampling method. I've put there around this sort of part here, the first few sentences. It's slightly staccato in style, which means it's a little bit stop, start, stop, start. That might be slightly harsh. It can be a little bit of a recurring flaw of this kind of chapter, a methods chapter, where because it's very direct and to the point and very targeted in the way it presents the information, can sometimes lose a little bit of flow and rhythm. So just be mindful of that. It's not necessarily a massive problem, but it can affect the readability of it. I think that the best way to get around that is to, if you search for transitional devices, they are phrases or words that can help you get from point A to point B and can help you connect sentences and keep the flow moving and help forge cognitive connections in your writing. The last point I wanted to make here is around this bit right at the end here, where it says 3. I'm just going to read this. It says the remaining 21% that did not identify as a student were not granted any incentives and their involvement was on a voluntary basis. I've put here that sometimes the lack of why or the absence of an exploratory nature can slightly undermine the rigor and clarity. Now, what I mean by that is because a methods is far more targeted and to the point and direct than a methodology, which can be more exploratory in a sort of discussion style. Sometimes there is the slight fear that you can slightly lose the sort of rigor and the clarity of why you adopted and made certain decisions. And so when I read this at the end here, the fact that that 21% did not identify as a student, were not granted any incentives, and their enrollment was on a voluntary basis, I'm sort of left wondering as a reader as to whether that matters. Was there anything that could have been put in place to circumvent that problem or to address that, or does it not really matter as a problem? There's a slight lack of clarity there, and that's because there's an absence of an exploratory nature. They don't feel the need to explore and discuss that, and that's to a degree fine because it's a methods chapter. But the point I'm making is just bear that in mind, that sometimes when you completely lose sight of the why, the what, how, why, when you lose sight of the why, you can just sometimes plant seeds of doubt in your reader's mind, and you don't want to do that, particularly in this chapter. So this is sort of the difference between the methods and methodologies. Some points there to sort of avoid, but also some points certainly to try and build on when you're doing your own methods or methodology chapter. Just very briefly, I mentioned validity and reliability earlier, 2 core concepts in a dissertation generally, but certainly in research. So the validity, there's a slight difference between the two, although there's overlap. Validity is the extent to which the instrument measures what it was intended to measure. So that's really ensuring that the design and approach and the decisions that you adopt and implement suit the purposes of your research. So for example, if I wanted to gain a complex understanding of 21st century of race and racial politics in 21st century Britain, and I sent a series of questionnaires out to participants with yes or no type questions, with yes or no type answers, I'm really not convinced that that would help me develop a complex understanding of race in 21st century Britain. Whereas if I used focus groups and loosely structured discussion and interview style, that would more likely get me to a place where I can understand race and racial politics in more of a complex way. So it's just making sure that the decisions made and the approach that you take generally suits what you're trying to achieve. Obviously, that's crucial given that you're trying to cultivate new knowledge and answer particular questions and so on and so forth. Reliability is very similar but slightly different. As I said, there is overlap between the two. And reliability is really the consistency with which you design and implement your research. So whereas validity is more about the suitability, reliability is more about the consistency. So validity, think about it as a sort of suitability. As I said, reliability is more consistency. There's some sort of examples there on the slide. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but that just gives you an idea. And earlier I said, the why really links to validity and reliability. And if you're justifying why you used interviews and why you use semi-structured style or whatever, that really will link to validity in some way. You're showing your reader that your research approach is valid, and it's a valid approach that you've taken. So that's why I suggested this stuff can be integrated throughout. It doesn't have to be. I'm not going to go into any detail or much detail on this anyway, because it's not a massive part of this chapter. It's a part of this chapter. It's important to address in some capacity. This idea of limitations, as I said, it can be in the conclusion or in the discussion, but it can also appear here in the methods or methodology. I think the overarching point I just want to make here is that you can sometimes shy away from addressing your limitations, the limitations in your study, because perhaps you feel as though you'll lose marks, but it's quite the opposite. In fact, no study is perfect, and actually highlighting and discussing the limitations of your study is actually a strength. It's not a weakness. I think the other point I would make that's important to consider is that you don't, although you address these limitations, you don't overemphasize them. I've put there at the bottom, put a positive spin on the limitations. Don't overstate them. So try and put your reader's mind at rest that you've at least considered these limitations, and you've tried to implement measures and put measures in place to soften the impact of these limitations, or you at least can highlight something else positive about the study that sort of, if not negates, then softens the limitation, as I said. And here's an example that you can just sort of pause the video and have a look at if you want. And that bit in blue highlighted there is really that's the point I was making. It's just sort of to soften a limitation. You can just put a positive spin on it in some way. And that's really important that you do that. Okay, I've made some sort of stylistic points already. Just remember about past tense. I've already mentioned that. Active voice or passive voice. This is something that can come up in a methodology. It's something that's quite often linked to scientific writing. The active voice is structured in terms of subject, verb, object. So we've got the example there that the researcher applied a 3-step coding process. So the researcher is the subject. Them applying is the action. That's what they're doing, and this 3-step coding process is the object of what they've done. That's the sort of the result structurally of that sentence. That's the active sentence. That's the active structure. The passive flips it, and it leads with the object, followed by the verb, followed by the subject, the person acting, or the thing acting. It doesn't. Sometimes the reason that people use a passive voice is because it's quite easy to completely omit the subject altogether. So there you could just say a 3-step coding process was applied. You don't even need to say who or what did that. And that's one of the reasons people quite like the passive voice in a methods or methodology chapter, is because it's not about you as the subject doing it so much. It's about the research itself. It's a slightly controversial argument, because obviously there's it's somewhat deceptive to neglect the role that you as the researcher have played in the methods or methodology and the design and implementation of your research. But that's just really I just wanted to point out the difference between the two, and basically just to say that really either is fine, and you can use them interchangeably, to be honest. You don't have to just use one or the other. As I said, passive, traditionally speaking, this is quite often more of a scientific approach. Active tends to be, more humanities, more social sciences. However, that's arguably a fairly archaic, traditional view of it, and you don't have to be, you don't have to just use one or the other. It doesn't really matter. It sort of comes down to what do you want to emphasize, and you can just use the active or passive voice interchangeably. First person or third, people ask me this, should you say I, or should you use the third person? I in this case would be the researcher or the author. Third person tends to be safest, but again, it sort of depends on the expectations and conventions of your discipline. Some don't like first, some prefer therefore third, Some don't mind first at all. Again, third tends to be more of a scientific tradition. First person tends to be more accepted in humanities, more accepted in social sciences. But talk to your supervisor about it. They might have their own opinion on it. I think the thing I would say is third is safest. You can't go too wrong with third person. I mean, obviously, in everyday life, if you refer to yourself in third person, it is slightly strange. Because you're sort of almost disassociating yourself from what you're saying. But in a written context, in an academic written context, it's accepted. It's fine. Just to reinforce, think about flow. It should read in a clear, linear way. Think about those transitional devices so that your style isn't too staccato, as I said earlier. Okay, so it's just to summarize just some of the main points we've established. I've put the house of cards, the foundations of the research. I didn't really mention this earlier, actually, but when I do this session in a face-to-face scenario, I sometimes get the students to actually build a house of cards. And the point I sort of make is that you building a house of cards is sort of reflective of the whole research process, because it's very precarious and it's carefully constructed, and something could go wrong and it can all sort of topple, and it can be frustrating, it's difficult to do, and all that kind of stuff. The reason the house of cards is particularly relevant in this chapter is if you make with your house of cards, if you make the foundational basis really strong, that holds up the house of cards and it's more likely to stand strong. And it's the same in research. If you get the foundations of the research right in terms of the decisions you make, in terms of how you did it and the methodological decisions and which design you implement, etc., that really strengthens the foundations of your research and will likely have a positive knock-on effect to the rest of the whole research and the whole cultivation of knowledge. So it sort of comes full circle. So that's just another way to sort of visualize what you're doing. That's why you just need to clearly articulate those key decisions that that you make at this stage. Methods or methodology. It's important to know the difference between the two. Often you're told in your structure whether it's a methods or methodology, and that's fine. Follow whatever you've been asked to do, but just make sure you're clear on what distinguishes the methodology from the method. So you sort of go back and look at those examples we've looked at and the way I described the difference between the two. Obviously, the methods being more targeted, more direct, more scientific. Traditionally, there's a what, how, why structure there. A slightly less emphasis on the why in the methods, but it's still important. The methodology is far more emphasis on the why. Clarity, precision, and rigor. Just be clear the language you use. Don't overcomplicate what you're saying. Be literal. And that layered structure moves out to in a linear, logical way in terms of the way you present the information that you're presenting in this chapter. Just to reinforce that what, how, why structure again at the end is very, very important. Okay, so I hope you found that interesting. I hope you found that useful. Please do go back and watch it again. I realize I go through a lot of information and it's complex at times, but I hope that's clarified some points for you, and I've managed to articulate myself well, and that's all clear. All the best with the writing of your dissertation, all the best with the writing of your methods or methodology, and I will hopefully see you for some of the other sessions that I have recorded.